Hello, everyone, and welcome to CCYA Interviews. I'm Vasu Bardwaj, and I'm your host for today's episode. Today, I'm happy to have with me the MLA for Calgary Fish Creek, Myles McDougall. Hi, Myles. How are you?
Hello. Very good. Thank you very much.
Yes, I can see in Alberta, it's a very sunny day. Sunny summers, right?
It is sunny, and it has been sunny this summer. That's for sure. We could actually use a little bit more rain, but we'll survive.
For sure. So I just want to say once again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your time. And just to get this interview started, I want to ask you, how did you get started into politics?
I first started at the university, actually, as an undergrad student. So I was an undergrad doing a double major in economics and poli-sci, and of course interested in politics. At that time, I was we had Peter Lougheed as premier, and we were fighting with the federal government and Pierre Trudeau. And I was feeling very passionate about some of these issues and signed up for the campus conservative club. And next thing I know, I'm getting involved in responsibilities and doing this and going to conferences and conventions and meeting other MLAs and MPs, and got very involved in the whole political movement. And my first job upon graduating was I got a job in the legislature as an executive assistant to the provincial treasurer. So it worked out from that perspective, although that wasn't my intention at the time. And that's how I got started.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's always great to hear that people got started at a young age and to see what they can do also later in life, having a greater impact in terms of governance and politics and things like that. So we're going to move on to our question and answer segment. And these questions are asked by members of our high school team. So the first one comes from Hayden Lai, and he wants to ask you, as a founder of PetroJet Canada, I understand that you are in favor of low-emission oil and gas solutions. I was wondering if you could offer more of an insight and your own opinion on the current LNG operations that have weighed down by the Federal Liberal and NDP legislature.
Well, I got to say, I just don't understand where the current federal government is operating. If our objective is to reduce CO2 emissions on the planet, and the biggest single source of CO2 emissions and the worst source of CO2 emissions is coal, LNG is a replacement for coal and has about half the CO2 emissions per unit of energy produced. Why would you not wish to make sure that LNG or natural gas would be available to those other jurisdictions that are demanding it? And so currently right now, by far the biggest producer of CO2 emissions is also the world's biggest consumer of coal, and that's China. Global coal demand, it continues to increase in China and other primarily Asian countries, but also in Africa and South America. And we have the opportunity to cut in half the CO2 emissions that are being utilized and happening today and continue to be growing in terms of those activities. So you would think that you would want to facilitate something that would do that. And yes, the federal government so far has been an obstacle to that process and procedure. And I just think it's wrong-headed, and I think it's a function of just not actually understanding the details of what actually is happening in the world and some of the more what should be easier ways that we can help mitigate the increase in CO2 emissions.
For sure. And it goes to show just the political agenda of this government. It's not the federal government. It's not necessarily backed by decisions or facts or anything like that. It's just a political agenda, and all we can hope for is a pure poly of government working together with a provincial Alberta government to get more LNG projects going and on board. And with the talking about the federal government and such, I want to move on to the second question from Stanley, and he wants to ask you, I understand that you have a considerable amount of experience as an economist. what do you think about the current state of the Canadian economy versus the provincial Albertan economy?
Well, currently, Alberta is the fastest growing economy amongst the provinces in Canada. And frankly, I would like everybody to be successful and produce. But if you look at what the policies have been that the federal government has, as current federal government, the Liberal government has put into Canada, it's made it very, very difficult for projects to happen. It has chased away investment. If we look at investment flows into Canada since 2015, it has been dropping steadily since that point in time to the net outflow of investment from Canada in a country that requires investment in order to create economic activity, jobs, employment, income. And so they're doing what seems to be the extent. It's not just oil and gas. It's natural resource development. It's mining, forestry, other things that we can be doing to maximize prosperity of Canadians. And it just seems to be an attitude that they are purposely wanting to depress the economic growth within Canada, whether it's because that's one way you can reduce CO2 emissions in an economy, or an anti-capitalist type of attitude, or anti-investment type of attitude. But it's wrong-headed, and it's going to be a problem. So economy is stagnating. We have all kinds of other issues that whether it's housing prices, interest rates, and like I said, a series of policies that have chased away capital out of Canada, and we're going to be paying the consequences for that.
For sure. And do you think that other provinces, or even at the federal level, Canada, could take any lessons from the Albertan government in terms of being the fastest growing province?
Well, there's, in part, we are fortunate, but part of this growth has been because oil and gas markets are strong right now, and so we benefit from that. But we also have a surplus budget right now. We have we're paying back our debt, so our taxes can be low. We can provide the government services that we require without the kind of high taxes that you'll see in other parts of Canada. All these are types of measures that put more pocket into our citizens, so they can be spending more and doing things that help generate the economy. So I think Alberta is considered an investment-friendly jurisdiction relative to many other places in Canada, despite what the federal government has been doing to dampen that. So I think these are kinds of things that we need to look at. Stay within your means, be attractive for capital, make business easier to do, and there'll be benefits for everyone.
For sure. And talking about the oil and gas industry, I want to move on to our next question. So Alberta's economy, majority of it is based in the oil and gas industry, and it contributes greatly in terms of revenue. So do you oppose the Paris Agreement, which seeks to shut down our energy industry and make it net zero?
Well, yeah, I think it's just not realistic, and there's a lot of things about the Paris Agreement that I have a problem with. I understand, and I'm not against the idea that we want to work towards reducing CO2 emissions. I'm in favor in that. However, what the Paris Agreement does is that it locks into a situation where it picks on a few countries and says you will have to meet certain targets, and other countries get a free walk. Just to say, places like China and India do not have to meet the same targets at the same rate. They're allowed to increase their CO2 emissions, and they're doing so. So I think we have to be a little bit more realistic. There's some targets that were set that were somewhat arbitrary, and they're going to have different consequences depending on the actual industrial structure or situation of each individual country. Here in Canada, for example, we happen to spend a lot of activity, or economic activity comes from natural resource development. Those activities, by their very definition, require high energy use. And so therefore, that's one reason why we have a high per capita energy use. Other things is we're cold. We have low density population in a big country. And so you add up all these things, and that's our specific issue and our specific concern that we have to manage and we have to work towards. Other jurisdictions may have industrial activities that do not require as much energy, or they have access to other energy sources that are not CO2 emitting, whether it be nuclear or hydro or electricity, things like that. And so there are differences between countries. There are differences in their stages of development. And I do not buy the fact that because, for example, our per capita use of energy and therefore CO2 emissions is higher than many others, that we're somehow, evil or bad. Are you suggesting that you have no economic development and therefore have lower CO2 emissions? That is altruistic or virtuous? Of course it isn't. We should be establishing targets that are reachable. Not one target, any of the targets so far that has been reached on these climate change propositions has ever met its target. And one of the reasons is this is not realistic of what they're doing, and it's arbitrary in the way that they've been setting these targets. And so it's going to fail. And I see that happening with the Paris Agreement. Even though we are spending literally billions of dollars on trying to make the kind of changes that the Paris Agreement talk about. So let's be realistic. Let's be fair. Let's recognize the differences between countries. And that would be something that I would find a little bit more.
For sure. It's all about setting realistic goals instead of over-promising and under-delivering, as we've seen with NDP and Liberal governments, whether on a federal or provincial level. And with this, I want to move on to the next question, and our final question of the Q&A segment. And as you know, Liberal red tape has been hampering efforts to build pipelines across Western Canada. What sort of legislative action can be taken by the UCP government to speed up these projects so our products can be properly exported?
It's interesting. You mentioned that I had a background in it. I used to be an oil and gas analyst once upon a time, focusing mostly exclusively outside of Canada. So I spent a lot of time in emerging markets and then the U.S. and Europe. And at that time, when you asked anybody in the industry about the regulatory structure for not only oil and gas but natural resource development, Canada was considered the gold standard. There was nobody better in the eyes of all kinds of jurisdictions around the world in terms of the professionalism and the rationality and the environmental concern than Canada. Then the Liberal government comes in and starts putting in all kinds of new regulations, new policies, including those canceling pipelines or making it almost essentially impossible for a new pipeline to ever be constructed in Canada. And it's not even just about pipelines. It's about major natural resource development projects. We have similar issues in mining and in other areas. And so, it's put a damper on these things. It's essentially put our country into handcuffs in terms of developing our resources and our industries. It's made us uncompetitive. And the consequences are there to see. We could be doing much better today than we are doing because we are unable to export our products at the degree that we could, and given the demand in the marketplace internationally. And so what can the government do? Well, I would hope that when the new federal government comes in, they will work to reverse some of the legislation that was put in place during the Liberal government and redo regulatory structure and make it a little bit more reasonable. Yes, we want to be concerned about the environmental issues. Yes, we want to be concerned about reconciliation, First Nations issues, and making sure that everybody's voice is heard and that we're doing things properly. But what we have today, whether it's pipelines or natural resource development generally, is a situation that it makes it almost impossible for a company to come in and invest the money, work towards a project, because it's too arbitrary and it's too anti-investment, too anti-business, and it takes too long. And that's not good for anybody.
100%. So I want to move on to our final segment of the show, where we will be talking about youth involvement and politics and more. So I want to ask you, what should young high school conservatives do in order to get more politically active? And what is one piece of advice you'd like to give them?
Well, I guess the key thing is to step up, get involved. I can tell you right now that pretty well any constituent association I've ever been involved with or group needs volunteers, needs people to help, is interested in people to get involved. And so that's the main thing to do. Get involved. Don't just be on the sidelines complaining. Get involved, meet your constituency executive, meet your MLAs, your MPPs, your MPs, and join your campus club or your high school club. And you will find very quickly that your talents and energy and abilities are more than welcome and will be utilized. And it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting, and you have a chance to make an impact.
For sure. I don't think anyone could have said that better. And I know I started my journey in politics by just canvassing and door knocking. And look at me now. I'm as involved as one youth can be. So thank you so much for your time today. And I really appreciate you coming onto the show. And well, we wish you well in the future.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Thank you.